So we'll get started. Welcome back. We hope you feel refreshed after having a week off. My name is Anna Marie Rutledge. I'm a climate outreach specialist with NIAX, and Courtney and I will be your instructors for this week's session. This is the 5th session in the Recreation Adaptation Planning and Practices course. And today we will be discussing step 5, monitoring and evaluating effectiveness of adaptation actions. I'm sure you're all very familiar with Zoom at this point, but just a reminder to mute yourself. And if you're using a phone, just turn off your computer speakers to avoid any feedback. And as you know, this course is led by a team of instructors specializing in climate adaptation. And you've met everyone at this point, but if you're ever interested, you can always learn more by going to forestadaptation.org/team. So our agenda today includes an introduction to step 5, monitoring, and then I'll hand it off to Courtney, who will walk us through a tutorial on using the adaptation workbook, and will also give us a summary of the work to be completed before our next class. So step 5, we'll review where we are this week. In the first week, you defined your goals and objectives, then you assessed your vulnerabilities in the second week. In the third step, you evaluated your goals and objectives given climate change considerations. And then in the fourth step, and I think this is probably everyone's favorite part, you were able to start developing adaptation tactics that address your challenges and capitalize on your opportunities. So this week, you will be brainstorming ways to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of your selected tactics. As you start to complete the adaptation workbook, you can also practice exporting your workbook to a PDF or Word document, and this will really help you visualize how each step is helping to communicate your intentional adaptation. And Courtney will show you how to do that in the tutorial part of this class today. You can also start to think about becoming an online adaptation demonstration project. So once you have exported your workbook, one of the instructors can easily turn it into a demo to be posted on our forest adaptation website, and you can go to that website and check them out. We have over 400 of them, and they're all really awesome. And then we can also update it when you begin implementation or other activities. And we'll talk more about that in the session next week as well. So monitoring is essentially about asking the right question that will help you detect desired conditions over time. There are several different types of monitoring that you'll encounter in science and management. So for example, in scientific research as a monitoring tool, we may have a question and a hypothesis, and with quality replication, we can judge deviation through time. But most of us will find this difficult and require many years before we can detect statistical change, so we don't often use this type of monitoring in adaptation planning. Another type of monitoring is impact or response monitoring, and this describes change over time. But this type of monitoring doesn't rigorously support cause and effect. It consists of repeated measurements done to specific standards. So for example, we use forest inventory and stocking surveys to measure growth, canopy cover, ground cover, or survival of planted seedlings. Phenology monitoring is another example where you might record the dates of leaf out or bird arrival every spring. This type of monitoring usually attempts to answer a particular question that is relevant to your management goals, but this type of monitoring can be expensive and time-consuming as well. So wherever possible, it's good to piggyback on those existing inventories or surveys. And then we have implementation monitoring, which can be useful if we're implementing an action because of climate change, and we want to monitor the execution of that change. And this is often a yes or no type of observation. And then lastly, we have effectiveness monitoring. So if you define the desired effect, did it work, and how will you know if it worked? For example, if you installed berms to slow the overland flow of water, after some time, is the water slowed? Does the downhill system become less inundated? This type of monitoring is usually carefully designed based on a conceptual model of a system and supports cause and effect over meaningful time periods. And this type of monitoring can work very well for adaptation. So the main task this week is to consider what existing monitoring efforts are available and if they need to be modified to better monitor the results of your adaptation actions. You can also consider what new monitoring items may be required to evaluate whether you have met your management goals. So the key questions here include, how do we know if the selected actions were effective, and what can we learn from these actions to inform future management? In this step in your adaptation workbook, you will first define your monitoring variable, or what you will measure. So identify monitoring items that will be useful to help evaluate whether you have achieved your management goals and objectives, or whether you have achieved a milestone that indicates progress towards your goals. So when possible, select monitoring items that will also help you understand whether the adaptation tactics recommended in the previous step were effective towards your management goals under climate change. And one example here is from a project at the Mark Twain Red Bluff Recreation Area in Missouri. And one of their management goals is to provide day use opportunities by providing safe access to the river for the general public, and also identify areas where day use infrastructure can be safely located within the flood zone. So for the monitoring variable in this example, the team identified 4 primary variables. The first one is user numbers, then visitor enjoyment or satisfaction, the amount of infrastructure damage and reduced days of access due to flooding, as well as providing an enhanced flood communication and warning system. So after doing that, you will then identify a value or a threshold that is meaningful for this monitoring item or variable. So think about the units that you're using to measure your metric and what your target number is. Based on the last example, still at the Mark Twain Red Bluff Recreation Area, what would success look like in this example? The team in this project identified several criteria for evaluation. So they plan on counting fee envelopes as well as traffic counters at various areas to document user numbers. They also plan on using comment cards as a way of measuring user satisfaction or enjoyment. They are planning to compare the costs of the repairs and cleanup post-flood before and after the infrastructure changes. And they will implement a measuring system that will measure real-time water levels to inform their enhanced flash flood warning system as well. And in this example, the team didn't identify really specific measurements, but for example, you could aim to increase visitor satisfaction by 20%, or you could aim to reduce the cost of repairs and cleanup by X number of dollars. And then finally, you will describe how and when this information will be gathered. So based on the last example, the team plans to work with their host and the rest of their team to collect visitor use data such as fees, traffic counters, and comment cards each week. They plan to evaluate the costs and infrastructure repairs each season, and to evaluate their early warning system by documenting whether people evacuated and if the early warning siren went off at the right time or if it was a misfire. So in this step, it's really important to identify any organizations or researchers that you could partner with to gather and track some of this information, and really utilize any resources you already have that could help aid the monitoring process, such as existing surveys or inventories. There are also existing networks like the Community Collaborative Rain, Snow, and Hail Network, or the National Phenology Network that you could tap into, add your data, and download regional data. So think of any partnerships or existing networks that can relieve some of the burden of this implementation. And please do let us know if there are any existing monitoring networks that could be useful for folks. And feel free to add that to the chat box if you can think of anything. So here's an example of putting this all together using all the examples I just went through. So just going through the first row here, the adaptation monitoring variable is user numbers. The criteria for evaluation is the number of fee envelopes and traffic counters. And the monitoring implementation is to collect these data weekly. And then another example would be looking at infrastructure damage and the reduced days of access due to flooding. The criteria is to compare the cost of repairs and cleanup post-flood, and the team plans to evaluate the cost of repairs seasonally. And so the example I just gave throughout the last 4 slides was a little more recreation oriented. So I also wanted to share another example of what this process might look like. So here, the adaptation monitoring variable is invasive species control. The criteria for evaluation is areas identified for control have less than 20% cover from invasive species. And then the monitoring implementation is annual invasive species surveys. Another example would be regeneration success. So the criteria for evaluation here is more than 50% of desirable species in the 0.5 to 2 inch class. And the monitoring implementation is a regeneration survey 2 to 4 years after harvest. And then another one, forest canopy cover. The criteria for evaluation is maintaining at least 60% cover across all riparian areas. And the implementation is a forest inventory every 5 years. So as you can see, this is just a little bit different than the last example and includes some more specific measurements and timelines. So just be sure to adapt this process to your specific project and what you hope to measure to evaluate whether your selected actions were effective. And then the outcome of this step is a realistic and feasible monitoring plan that can help determine whether management should be altered in the future to account for new information and observations. So you've seen this graphic before, and you should have an idea of the intentionality each step brings to our climate-informed action plans. This is important because it helps connect the dots from these broad concepts to specific actions for implementation. And this process works both ways. So as we finish our monitoring plans, our metrics are directly linked to measure the effectiveness of our adaptation tactics, which describe how we will implement our strategies and our overall concepts of resistance, resilience, and transition. And we can trace these to the management challenges and opportunities and the direct impacts on our systems for which we have identified our goals and objectives. Monitoring ultimately helps us know whether we are on track to meet those management goals and objectives. And with all of that, we hope you're ready to tackle this last step of the adaptation workbook. I think a lot of us really like this step because we find the brainstorming part to be really fun, and we hope that you might find new ways to tap into existing monitoring efforts. All right, I am going to pause there and I'm going to pass it over to Courtney to start sharing her screen. And then as I do that, if there are any questions you have for Courtney and I about step 5, feel free to go ahead and ask them. Otherwise, we'll also have time at the very end of the lecture after we go through the adaptation workbook tutorial as well.
Thanks, Anna Marie. Does anyone have any questions about monitoring and what that looks like? Or feel free to share some of the different networks that you've used to think about monitoring for your projects in the past or ones that you're interested in for this course as well. Any recommendations or questions? All right, well, feel free to keep typing those into the chat as we go through this tutorial section. And so Anna Marie just outlined the 3 things to really consider when you're thinking about monitoring for your projects. And so I'm just going to show you the quick tutorial of how to incorporate that into the adaptation workbook online. And so again, you'll want to add your monitoring variable, your criteria for evaluation, and your implementation plan. And then of course, this week there's going to be a homework for step 5, and then I'll show you how to complete and export your plan using the print function to save your projects as a PDF. And so when you log into the adaptation workbook and you pull up step 5, you'll see that there is the option to add a monitoring variable. And so you'll click on that orange box and it'll pull up a different box for you to input all of your different information. And so this is where you can really get creative and start to add all of the details for what do you want to monitor to know if you're successful at meeting your management goals and objectives. And how are you going to tell whether or not you're successful with that criteria for evaluation? And then finally, what is your monitoring implementation plan? How are you actually going to execute the monitoring to tell whether or not you're meeting those thresholds? And so you can put all of that information here into these different text boxes and hit save. And then the next step will be to apply them to your management goals and objectives. And so you'll have the option to toggle between that yes or no for that monitoring variable and make sure that you're applying it to the proper management goals and objectives for your project. And then, of course, there will be the homework for step 5. So just a couple of quick questions for you to complete. And then with all of that, you are done and you have completed all of the steps for the adaptation workbook process. And so the most important step is to make sure that you're saving and sharing your plan. And so you will want to, at the very bottom of that column on the left side of the adaptation workbook, you will see at the very bottom, there's an export and share plan option. And so you'll want to hit that, and then you can select the print current version of your PDF. And then when you do that, it'll pull up a little comment box and it'll say this climate adaptation plan has been formatted for printing in landscape mode. So all you need to do is hit OK. And then finally, there'll be an option to save. And so then you can save it as a PDF to your computer so that you can reference your plan later. And so then that's really it. And all you need to do to save your plan, it's pretty easy, but if you have questions, feel free to ask any of us and we're happy to walk you through that process. Or if you're running into any issues or can't save it for any reason, please let us know. And then for next week, before our next lecture, you'll want to make sure that you can complete step 5. So make sure that you go in and add your monitoring and evaluating effectiveness information, complete the homework, and then there is no discussion session this week, but we're all here if you have questions or want to use office hours or just want to meet about your projects and run any ideas by the team. There's an optional reading this week as well. So it really goes into federal outdoor recreation trends. And so that link is in the syllabus, and I've also posted it into the chat for you to reference if you're interested in exploring that in more details. And then there's also a reading on forest inventory, which is within the adaptation workbook and the syllabus as well, if that's something you're interested in learning more about. And so our next discussion will be next week, and our next lecture will also be next Monday, May 17th. And that's where we're going to dive into talking about communication concepts and tips and things that might be helpful for when you're discussing climate change with your networks and your partners. And so with that, we've got a pretty short lecture this week. That's all we've got. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. We can stick around for a couple of minutes. And it looks like there's been some great suggestions added to the chat as well of some different monitoring networks. So make sure you check those out too. So with that, anyone have any questions or comments or additional monitoring networks to share? And it looks like there was one question from Debbie about some of her tactics were long-term, so looking 20 years out. Is the monitoring intended to be purely after implementation, or is there a place for monitoring of existing conditions to help inform when the action should be implemented? And that's a great question. So there's not really a separate place to input that information. It all goes into those same call out boxes in the adaptation workbook. But I do think it's worth, when you're talking about your implementation plan for monitoring, really entering that time frame for what you're thinking. So is this something you're going to do immediately before you go and implement your actions to tell whether or not they're successful, or is this something you're keeping track of after you've implemented your tactics 5 years into the future, or 10 years into the future, or 20 years out, to make sure you're meeting those thresholds for success? And then, yes, the communication lecture, if you have other team members interested to attend, as Anna Marie said, they're definitely welcome to attend. So feel free to share that Zoom link. It's a really helpful lecture, I think, for communicating climate change adaptation with all of your different partners. Any other questions or comments? Awesome. Well, that's all we have for you this week. So feel free to, communication will be next week on Monday, May 17th. Yep. And there's no discussion this week. So feel free to reach out to any of us if you have questions or just want to talk about your project or brainstorm any ideas. And we're always here to help. So thanks everyone for your participation, and we'll see you next Monday, May 17th.